So first, I just want to ask you kind of if you're aware of the risks of concussions throughout your playing career, and kind of how has your education changed since then?
Yeah, I don't think that when I had my first concussion when I was 13, I don't think I knew anything more than I had heard it as a term sort of bounced around with NHL players. But I was really lucky that I found after my second concussion, I got to work with Dr. Tatter, who founded the Parachute Foundation and has been doing concussion work for a number of years.
Hmm.
And he really introduced me to the scope of what a concussion is and explaining the way that this invisible injury is so difficult to understand if you haven't had it.
Right.
And so by the time I was 14 and had my second concussion already, it was already very clear that this is something that you can't just mess around with because it's something that will linger with you for the rest of your life.
No, for sure, and it's one of those things where it's very tough to see when you're going through it, and you have such a perspective to kind of look through it now. Um, how do you think concussions have affected your life both on and off the ice?
Yeah. So one of the things that I wrote down when I saw that question was for on the ice. There really isn't any more on the ice for me because I stopped playing a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
Um,
same here.
and I don't think that I felt anything different when I was on the ice. I once I knew the risk, and I had worked with Dr. Tatter. I had gotten myself back to being able to play both from my second concussion and my third concussion. Um, Once I was aware of that risk, I knew that if I was playing scared, all I was going to do was put myself at a greater risk of injury. So I
Right.
don't think there was anything that was different about my life on the ice. Certainly, I was aware when players would come over the blue line and shoot and fly a puck by my head, it would obviously cross my mind, but I never let it impact the way that I played because again, that's the recipe for getting hurt. But
For sure.
um, off the ice, it definitely. I mean, my last concussion. I had to take a year off of school, so that was not just athletics and academics, but my whole life. But the sort of unseen, untalked about personality quirks that come along with being a concussion survivor. I was very short with people. My personality wasn't the same. Most of those things have gone back to as normal as a goalie can be.
Right.
But I still get headaches when the weather changes. And one of the other things that I haven't quite been able to shake is high pitched noises send me like over the edge with a headache almost instantly. So like the screeching of car brakes,
Right.
um, that's one of those things that I still deal with on a day-to-day basis. But for the most part, I've found a way not necessarily to get over it, but to move through it and sort of work within the bounds of what I can do.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact that like with the concussion, it's more than just simply the sport. There's so many other factors that go into it. And just talking to you before and hearing about your story, you said that your last concussion was 7 years ago, and the fact that it's very much still in your life. And for me, mine was 2 years ago, and same thing. So I think that's very good to have these conversations and understand that there are some risks even farther down the road.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that is so tough about concussions as an injury. With most other injuries, that there's a timeline that you can expect in terms of recovery, and the recovery milestones are very visible and easy to sort of check the box.
Hmm.
And even with something, the likening it to whether you break your arm, you break your leg, you're in a cast. Eventually, you get the cast off, you start doing rehab, you start feeling normal. You may always limp, but it's not going to impact. It won't impact the way that you interact with other people or how
Right.
you interact with yourself. And that's a thing that you get with brain injuries that you don't get with that you don't necessarily get with long-term physical injuries.
Yeah, and you mentioned when we talked about the idea that you're always such a very educated, studious person, and when you were going through your concussions, it was so hard to kind of get back to your normal. So I'm curious if you can just talk about, your experiences as a student athlete dealing with concussions.
Yeah, being a student dealing with concussions, whether you're an athlete or not, is tough because I think there is still some hesitancy in staffing and administration that concussions are, because it's an invisible thing. It's, it's like, my leg is sore. I don't want to participate in gym class, when that's really not the case.
Right.
But my last concussion, I was in a car accident with my parents. And when I eventually took the year off from school, I came home, was doing the whole sit in the dark, not do anything that was particularly strenuous. Eventually felt good enough to go back to school, but I didn't realize at the time that the way that I learn was completely different than before the concussion. And
Right.
so when I went back as a sophomore, not only had the group of people that I had gone through the sort of shock of freshman year with, they had already gone through sophomore year and
Right.
were a tight knit group. Um, I came back as a sophomore, joining a new group of people as a sophomore class, trying to figure out how to study and learn basically from scratch, because my old habits and my old way of learning wasn't cutting it. And my grades suffered as a result. My sophomore year was probably one of the poorest years for me academically. But I was very lucky that for the most part, I had professors who were understanding and willing to sort of work with the teaching staff to get me what I needed.
Right.
Um, and if I hadn't had that level of interaction with the professors, so that they actually knew that this wasn't something that I was making up because I didn't feel like doing my reading, it would have been a much more difficult climb for me for the last 3 years of my degree, for sure.
No, and I think that's a really important point, just having support, and why we want to have these conversations. The fact that, not everyone does have that support. And really, I do want to reach the people, I want to be able to help people that are dealing with concussions, but being able to reach the people that are directly related to someone, whether that be exactly like you said, a teacher, a boss, a friend, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, someone that doesn't understand and really needs to understand. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about concussions and whether it's traumatic brain injuries or things like mental health, um, it's one of those invisible things. So you think that there are far fewer people who actually deal with these issues than there really are.
Mhm.
And I think mental health is a really great example of the ways that, as a society, we've started talking about these things more. So you realize, oh, that person who I grew up with, who I just ran into, that person looks like they may have something that they're dealing with. Oh, my older sister has something. Like, we've all got something that we're dealing with. And I
Right.
think with concussions, with mental health, anything that's an invisible injury that we don't like to talk about, the more that people like you and I can have those conversations out in the open and sort of empower those people to know that they're not dealing with something that is completely unprecedented, and that they're alone.
Right.
For me, that was a really important thing to have, not just with my family, but like you said, with the professors and my friends, trying to understand. Not all of them could, but the effort to try and understand what a person's going through when it's really hard to articulate and to explain because you don't understand it
At
completely
all. Yeah.
yourself is huge.
Yeah, and it can be very alienating, and on that same topic, like there's such a stigma around both concussions and just in terms of being an athlete and being a student. And we talked in the past about some of the experiences you saw as a teammate, and wanting to be a voice because what you've been through. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think in terms of the general stigma for athletes and concussions, I think we've made serious progress.
100%.
With the sort of you play through anything mentality. I look at, this weekend with Pat Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, great examples, very talented young football players who both
Hmm.
were pulled out of their games in the playoffs when it matters. It's all of those things that as a young athlete you think, well, I can never take myself out because, my team needs me.
Hmm.
Whether or not Pat Mahomes plays next weekend is a different story, and that my perspective might change next weekend when he's inevitably back out there. But
Yeah.
um, I think the other thing that's sort of an underlying nuance for me in particular is women. I think it can be challenging also because there's this little voice that we always have in the back of our head that's telling us not to complain and not to be annoying and not to be obnoxious. And I've seen that affect the care that some women who I know who have had concussions have gotten.
Right.
And doctors and therapists who aren't trained the in concussions, in recognizing symptoms and all of the adjacent symptoms, not just, I can't track with my eyes or I have headaches. It can be really tough to get the help that you need.
For sure.
And as much progress as I think we've made from a stigma perspective, I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of making actual change so that we don't feel like Pat Mahomes and Lamar Jackson coming out of a game when they're clearly both concussed is an anomaly and not the rule.
For sure. No, and what you just described was exactly what I went through in terms of my concussion recovery. It wasn't until I found my osteopath, which is about the fifth or sixth different type of therapy, where I found someone that was on my side and really cared about getting better and helping more than simply, hey, you're concussed. What can we, go rest? And so that was really
Yeah,
encouraging for a
and
while.
that's the other thing. I think for a long time, the going wisdom and the treatment plan was, you sit in the dark and you wait for your symptoms to go back, and then you go for a walk and see if the symptoms come back, and then if you can do that, then you try and get your heart rate up a little more. And so
Right.
one of the things that I found during my last concussion when I was home for that full year was the the symptoms for me were so bad that I couldn't try that progression. And for a long time, I couldn't try that progression, which only added to the total depression and despair that I was feeling, because I had gone from being a Division 1 athlete and a student and a person to not being able to walk around the block without feeling like I was going to throw up.
Right.
And so finding the right kinds of treatment where you are in your recovery. So for me, it started with I was seeing a muscle activation therapist. I was seeing someone to help me with my vision. There are all sorts of things that you can do in the interim that don't require you to be completely isolated. And I think that's one of the most important things that I found in that recovery was, even if you're recovering, you don't have to be by yourself. You can be interacting with people,
Hmm.
especially when you find people who understand, right? So
That's
you
a big
find a therapist who understands that, they're working on your head and your neck. They should turn the lights down in the therapy room.
Mhm.
Like simple things like that seem obvious, but when you're in it and you realize how few people actually get it, makes such a huge difference.
It makes a massive difference. Just simply getting it. That's a great point again. I wanted to ask you about you had a pretty big role in passing Rowan's Law and being on the legislative floor. So I just want to ask what that experience was like, and if you would explain a little bit more about Rowan's Law.
Yeah, that was a huge honor for me. Because I was still in high school, so I had suffered those first two concussions. So I knew that again, I was at a private school for athletes, so I was very lucky that the administration understood that this wasn't just a kid who was trying to, get out of writing her exams.
Right.
But I realized very quickly that not everybody had that opportunity,
For
and
sure.
I wasn't the only kid in the Greater Toronto area who had suffered a concussion. Like, plain and simple, that's just not the way it goes. Whether you're a hockey player or not, there are ways that you can get concussed. Like my last concussion was a car accident. And it was really powerful for me to be able to speak while this bill was on the floor to humanize what the impact of this kind of legislation could be.
Right.
And I think the few people who got a chance to speak, it becomes really hard to ignore when you're looking someone in the face. You can see that it's impacted them
It's very powerful.
and
For
they're
sure.
calling for change. And so it was a really cool moment for me, and one of the reasons that I continue to come on, podcasts like this and talk with Heads Up Canada and with the Concussion Legacy Foundation. The more that you can put a real face and a story to this invisible thing that we deal with, I think the
Mhm.
better off we're going to be at ultimately changing that culture.
Yeah, and it seems like it's giving you a voice, and you're not only passionate about it, but you're you care about it, and I think that's really good that you have a purpose, and you're helping people. Even something as simple as me, who's been through the same thing and understands. So I think that's really great.
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying that we have with the Harvard hockey program, that you always want to leave the jersey better than you found it,
Mhm.
and that's a thing that I carry with me, especially with my work talking about concussions, because I would never say to someone that I regret playing hockey or that I wouldn't let my kids play hockey if and when I have kids, like none of that.
Hmm.
hockey was a thing that was so integral to my personality and my growth and my maturity as a person that I would never discourage someone from taking up the game.
For sure.
But I definitely am aware that there are things that can change. And if I'm not willing to speak about those things to change, then how am I expecting that the game is going to change? And so I try very hard to be as vocal and outspoken about it, with the eye to, if you can leave it better than you found it, then you've done something important.
For sure, that you have done something important. I think that's really, really a important thing. I'm wondering if it has any influence on what you're doing right now with Sports Innovation Lab.
I think it does and it doesn't. I got really lucky. Again, I feel like I keep saying I got really lucky. Um, it impacts that I wanted to work in sports,
Yeah.
because it was such a huge part of my identity when I was a kid and then moving into college. So I got lucky that I could continue to work in sports. But even further, I work Sports Innovation Lab is we're a small company. So I'm very lucky that both of the founders were athletes. And so when the weather changes and, I'm sitting at my screen and I can't think, they're not looking at me like, why is this kid not doing anything?
No, they
They're
can
much more
understand.
understanding and give me the leeway to, if you can't sit at your desk anymore, go home and finish your day from home. Um, and one of the very first projects that I was working on when I got hired right out of school was looking at the sort of the landscape of concussion technology that's available, both in terms of concussion detection and in terms of like treatment.
Right.
And I think that was it was easy for my bosses to see that it was something that I was passionate about and that was a way that I could contribute early. And I think that's been huge, being able to work with people who are willing to understand or willing to empathize even if they don't understand. That's a big thing for anybody who's either currently suffering or on the mend. Finding people who are willing to empathize, it's life changing, as I'm sure you know. If you
Yeah,
can find those people, that's what becomes really powerful.
for sure. And then you mentioned the fact that like hockey was your whole identity, and not being able to play anymore. For me, like I didn't play that high of a level, but just losing hockey and realizing I was done was such a harsh reality for the first little bit. And it wasn't until I realized that there are other things in life, and I can focus on not just playing hockey, that I really was able to find my voice as well.
Yeah, I
But
think that identity crisis of when something is so integral to who you are. I always said, when I was introducing myself, that I was a hockey player, I was a goalie. That was part of the first few, hi, my name is Molly and I'm a goalie. That was the thing. And
right.
I was proud of it because I worked at it and it was something that I loved. And to have that go away, um, is a really challenging thing to deal with at a relatively young age. When my career ended, I was 23, going to be 24, and again, I was lucky that I had already found Sports Innovation Lab, so I was already looking ahead to the next thing.
Right.
But I know for my piece of your introduction. So something as simple as, oh, my name is Molly. I was an athlete. I was a hockey player. Like, how do you navigate that space between this is who I always was and this is who I am now? And finding the thing that you can focus your athlete energy on in your goal setting and in something that's a challenge and something forward thinking. That's the best way that I've seen to manage that inevitable identity crisis that we all face when our career ends. Because I mean, for women in particular at this point in time, there's absolutely a shelf life. For a lot of us, it was college.
Hmm.
Thankfully, there are more opportunities to play professionally, and there continue to be more opportunities. But even if you're going to play in the NHL, there's a shelf life on your career, and finding the thing that is what's next, um, for me was a really big way to ease the anxiety of the inevitable, holy shit, my hockey career is over.
No, and I think you have such a unique perspective on the sport now that you're outside of it. And you talked a little last time we spoke about, being a good teammate and looking for signs for someone that may have a concussion. I'm wondering if you can give some advice to the next generation of hockey players or just athletes in general, just about the risks of concussion and just how to kind of mitigate through that.
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice, or the biggest thing that I would say to the next generation of athletes, is being a good teammate doesn't mean just showing up and being there on the field. Being a good teammate means showing up for your teammates in every sense of the word. And that means off the ice and on the ice, or on the field and off the field. I think at the time when you're competing, when you're young, you assume that the only way to contribute and to be a good teammate is by doing your job on the field.
Mhm.
And I don't think that that's necessarily true. If I was talking to a group of younger hockey players, I would try and get them to understand that taking care of the whole person who you sit next to in the locker room is way more important than whether or not you win a game.
For sure it is.
And it's hard to get somebody to understand that when you're in it. And I was a perfect example. I had my second concussion. I knew something was wrong. I got hit in the middle of a game and I didn't come out. But I think one of the things that somebody asked me once about concussions, what could somebody have said to you at the time to maybe change that decision to stay in the game? And my answer was, and continues to be, if someone had said to me, this is not what's best for your team because you are not in your right state of mind
Right.
and you're putting your life on the line, I think it would have been a much different thought process and a much different rationale than, well, I'm the number one goalie and the game's not over, so I need to keep playing.
Mhm.
Um, the idea that I was not only putting my own health on the line, but that I wasn't doing what's best for my team. That was the thing that, looking back, hindsight is 2020 and all those other cliches. But I think that might have been the only thing that would have caused me to pause and say, okay, if I'm not doing what's best for my team and I know something's wrong, this is a time that I should raise my hand and say something's wrong.
No, that's great. And I think that a lot of teammates, coaches, parents need to hear that, the idea that winning the game is not everything. Treating your teammates and your friends with respect and health and making sure they're okay is integral. On a related topic, I wanted to ask you, you know, how much of an issue is mental health in hockey and sports, and is there a direct relation to concussions?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think the hockey community in general, I don't think does a great job about mental health because, like concussions, it's invisible.
Yeah.
And there's this ethos of hockey players being tough and, you block a shot, you get up, you continue your shift. They're bleeding, you continue playing. The image that I have of Steven Stamkos when he fell into the net and broke his shin
Oh,
and
he
he got
broke
up and
his leg.
skated
Yeah.
off. Like, those are what we think of when we think of hockey player tough.
Right.
But I don't think that we think about the struggles that we face as athletes with our personal lives, with our academic lives, within hockey. There were a lot of things that I struggled with mentally within the scope of hockey as a goalie. First
Hmm.
and foremost, that anytime I made a mistake, it was on the scoreboard.
Right.
Let's talk about that for a beginning. But then there were things like when I got to college, I didn't play. I wasn't a starter. How do you deal with that after 10 plus years of being the go-to guy?
Being super
You
competitive. Yeah.
it's a completely different thing. And so that personality that I had suddenly went away and I had to figure out what was my new identity. And so part of that, that question earlier about that loss of identity, I think I had already also dealt with that a little bit in the transition from high school to college.
Right.
But the mental health aspect that we like to ignore because we assume that mental toughness and mental strength is the same as mental health
And it's not.
is is a massive, massive red flag for me. Um, I would love to see minor hockey organizations spend half as much time on mental health and true mental toughness as they do practicing their power play, their penalty kill, or doing off ice training.
Absolutely.
Um, I remember we had every year in the summer, we had 2 weeks of training camp where we went over, we had binders, playbooks and face offs, and we were on the ice for a few hours. We were working out, we were back on the ice. Why didn't we spend any time talking as a group, learning about the struggles that we were inevitably going to face on the ice, off the ice, as people? I think all of those lessons that you learn as an athlete are so applicable to everything else that you do, and you don't realize it until you're out of your hockey world and into whatever your next thing is. But
Mhm.
being able to learn and hone those skills at an earlier age, I think would make such a difference for a whole generation of kids who get to grow up feeling that they are hockey player tough, but that doesn't mean that they have to sacrifice everything that they are for the current, state of your team.
No, absolutely. And on my own personal story, when I got my last concussion, my fourth one, like I was still very much involved with the men's league team that I played on. And I would just go just because wanted to go watch, and I was the team administrator. And I used to bring the water bottles and the pucks. So there's so much more than just being a hockey player. And I used to show up at the rink and every week and ask the same question: "Why are you out there? You look fine." And it was crushing to me, to the point where I had to just stop going. Like, and exactly that. If you aren't prone to being in that world, and just it can be crushing. Like,
Yeah, and I would love to see a hockey culture and a world in which the person who continues showing up for their teammates isn't on the defensive as to why they're not out there.
right.
Um, I had a similar experience that year that I was off from school. I went to visit my teammates in the middle of January, so I had been home for 5.5 months, and um, I remember the other athletes who were on campus at the time, you know, come up, hug me. What are you doing here? We haven't seen you. Where have you been? And it's the same conversation. Well, I have a concussion. I'm still healing, so I'm not on the ice.
Right.
Oh, but like you look great. Well, thank you, but I don't feel great and my brain's not working. So, looks can be deceiving. And I would love to, again, that shift in culture and thinking. If 5, 10, 15 years down the road, there's a kid who has a concussion, knows that it's time for her to sit out, continues to show up for her teammates, that's the kid that I want on my team,
Yeah.
because you've got no reason to be there except to be a good teammate. You're not contributing on the ice. You're not going to be the league MVP. The people who are there scouting aren't going to see you on the ice, but everybody, including your teammates and more importantly you, know that you have a place that you still belong. And that's a thing that, again, I think if we took mental health more seriously, there would be a way for those of us who either were dealing with or had dealt with concussions could make that a more inclusive and welcoming space for people who have suffered, whether it's again with hockey or without hockey, or with your sport or without your sport. Just being able to continue to have some sense of normalcy is massive in any sort of recovery.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. Just feeling like you belong. That's
Yeah,
that's
the
exactly
feeling like you can continue to belong to the thing that you always felt that you belong to,
you love.
right?
Exactly.
Like it's one thing to find a group of like-minded people who have suffered concussions, or if you take up a different hobby that doesn't bother your brain, but it's another thing entirely to feel like you still belong to the thing that you love.
Mhm.
And that's where I would love to see um hockey culture and sports culture at large make that change.
For sure, and I'm on the same boat. I would love to see that and see it now. I wanted to just last ask you, what's your best piece of advice you give to anyone out there with concussion?
My best piece of advice. I think the first thing is the rest of your life is never worth one game, even if it feels like it is at the time. And I only feel that I can say that because I made the poor decision to continue playing through a brain injury, and I have suffered the consequences of that choice, and continue to do so. Not
Yeah.
that I don't regret anything I learned. I got to become an advocate and all these other things. But it's never worth the rest of your life. And that's what you're dealing with when you deal with brain injuries. I would say you're not going to help your team by playing the equivalent of if you went out there with a broken leg. You're not helping your team. There's something that's holding you back, and you're not going to be contributing the way you want to. And I think the last and most important thing that I've really had to internalize, not just, when I'm outwardly talking about my concussions, but it's a constant reminder and battle that I have with myself, is embracing my new normal. I may never feel exactly like I did before I was in the car accident.
Mhm.
I understand that. It's very difficult to reckon with as a type A personality, that I may not ever feel like I'm at the top of my game again, but that doesn't mean that I'm not still me. And that doesn't mean that I'm not still good at what I do and able to contribute. But finding and embracing that new normal has been the most important thing for me in recovering and being able to feel like I'm still me.
That's a really important point, especially for people that are very much involved with the concussion and still involved with the sport and can't give it up. To understand that that there are other reasons to not play the sport and to protect your brain.
Yeah, and I think again it's hard when you're in it to know that that there are things outside of your sport. But I had a teammate in college who got absolutely creamed when she was a sophomore in open ice. Like it was one of those kinds of hits that if you saw it in the NHL, you like your jaw would hit the floor.
Right.
And there's technically no body checking in women's hockey, so it was like blatantly obvious. And she had to stop playing because she had had concussions previously, and she found a way to stay involved with our team. So that sense of belonging and that sense of identity that she was a Harvard hockey player never left her. She didn't feel
Right.
like she had to leave that behind, even though she wasn't playing. And it was hard, obviously.
Very hard.
All you want to do is get back on the ice and play. But I think finding that balance between being who you are and who you want to be and everything that you will be in the future is a really important and really difficult thing to deal with when you're in that place where you can't think straight and all you want to do is just get back to normal.
No, I agree, and I think you have such a powerful voice in the subject, and I think you're very passionate, and you're going to make a big difference in the world coming up future. So it's really great to talk with you, and I would love to talk to you in the future as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. This has been great. I
No
like
problem.
like I said, I'm always happy to get out there and tell my story, because if even one person hears it and has some sort of small aha moment about what they're dealing with, then it's worth it.
It's worth it, 100%. All right. Well, thank you so much, and have yourself a great day. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
See you, Molly.